afternoon. My name is Amos Fiora, and I am the Director of the Institute for Global Security, Law and Policy here at Case Law School. It is a pleasure to have all of you here for the lecture today. Today's lecture, I think the way to best define it is incredibly eclectic, totally different, and incredibly engaging. And that is a direct reflection of the speaker who we have today, Professor Ed Kaplan of Yale. I don't say Yale Law School, we're always law school, but Professor Kaplan is one of the most original, creative, and imaginative academics in America today. He's going to talk about suicide bombing, he can talk to you about AIDS, about any number of different issues, but today we're going to talk about suicide bombing. And when I say that Professor Kaplan is creative and imaginative, he is able to take an enormous amount of information to analyze it from a number of different perspectives. That frankly is very unusual in academia, and we truly are privileged to have Professor Kaplan with us today. Without further ado, please.
Thank you very much, Amos, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm quite pleased to see the level of interest here, and it's really a pleasure to be here at Case and Case Law School for the very first time. The topic of discussion today is the tactical prevention of suicide bombings in Israel. This is not so much going to be a talk about the politics of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Rather, the emphasis is going to be evaluative. We want to know what are the actual countermeasures which have been employed in Israel, and which of these have been successful, which have been less successful. What can we learn about the ability to actually interrupt the terrorism campaign? So, for those of you who have been paying attention to the news, there was a suicide bombing just this past Monday in Eilat, Israel's southernmost town. It's the first time there was ever a suicide bombing in Eilat. And it's also the first suicide bombing that's taken place in Israel in quite some time. Here are some recent suicide bombings in Israel. As I said, there was the Eilat bombing on January 29th. The last suicide bombing before that was last year in April. And before that, December of 2005. So in spite of what you may believe about the situation in Israel vis-a-vis suicide bombings, these events have actually become quite rare in the last few years. But while successful bombings are rare, attempted suicide bombings are not rare. Usually you hear about something in the news when it works, when there's actually a bombing that succeeds and people are killed or many people are injured, you hear about it. You don't always hear about attempts, but if you pay attention to what is going on, you'll discover that in fact there were lots of alerts in response to suicide bombing attempts all the time. For example, here's one from January the 24th, just a few days before the Eilat bombing. A heightened security alert was put into effect along the West Bank border with Israel, the Green Line, from Modi'in to Rosh Hashanah due to intelligence information that terrorists were planning to carry out an attack, and the Israel Army radio reported. Little snippets like this show up in the Israeli media, Hebrew and English, all of the time. From January the 7th, 2007, here we have a suicide bombing that was actually thwarted. What you have in front of you is a picture of the vest that was actually intended to be used in this attack. The attack would have been carried out by a 16-year-old boy. So this was of January the 7th. It's believed that the suicide bombing that successfully occurred in Eilat was carried out by someone who infiltrated into Israel via Egypt. There have been 100 infiltrators captured who have attempted to come into the country via that route. There are hundreds of terror alerts all the time. So we have this interesting situation where attempted suicide bombings, attempted acts of terror continue at a very high pace, but successful acts of terror inside Israel are actually quite rare these days relative to years past. And as I said, successful suicide bombings in Israel were not always rare. And if we focus on the main years of the Second Intifada, 2001 through 2003 inclusive, and if we just look inside the Green Line, inside the 1967 borders of Israel, more than half of all Israeli casualties in the conflict over that time period were due to suicide bombings, and that includes actually all the deaths in the West Bank and Gaza as well. So here's actually a bill of deaths on the Israeli side here. There are 73 deaths in all of Gaza, 240 in the West Bank, 471 deaths inside Israel, civilians due to suicide bombings, 94 deaths of other types from terrorism. So about 900 people killed by terrorism inside Israel and the occupied territories over these 3 years, with suicide bombings responsible for more than half of them. And this is actually the incidence of these deaths over 3 years. And the thing to note is that you have quite a bit of variability in the number of people killed per attack. The worst case by far, March of 2002, a suicide bombing at a Seder, a Passover Seder in Netanya. And you have many other events where, in some cases, 1 or 2 people were killed. In other cases, only the perpetrator was killed in the attack. Here's actually a distribution of deaths for suicide bombing. It works out on average to 5.5. The number of people who were killed in Eilat was 3. Any death is tragic, but historically, that actually was a relatively small casualty count relative to what was typical over the 3 years from 2001 to 2003. It's not only people who die. These bombs are packed with shrapnel. They're packed with nails, with screws, and so forth. This is a pelvic imagery of someone who was injured in a suicide bombing, and you can see all of the nails quite clearly on this X-ray. Now, these suicide bombings had popular Palestinian support during the height of this campaign. There is a Palestinian public opinion polling agency, quite well respected, the Jerusalem Media Communication Center. And in the same way that the Gallup poll conducts presidential approval ratings in this country, this organization conducted what they called POP polls, Palestinian opinion polls, of randomly selected people living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And there are a number of questions that were repeated in these surveys. For example, how would you rate the performance of Yasser Arafat when he was in power? Or of the following leaders, who do you trust the most? And they would list Yasser Arafat or Ahmed Yassin, the former head of the Hamas, and so forth. A number of questions. One question that was regularly asked in these polls was, what is your feeling about suicide bombing operations against Israeli civilians in Israel? And this is a translation of the actual wording, so it's clear that the question is about suicide bombings, and it's clear that the question is targeting Israeli civilians. And this is what the results from this poll showed over the 3 years. Basically, a decline in the level of support, but always high. If we take a look at people who somewhat support this statement, they are somewhat supportive of suicide bombing operations against Israeli civilians, or they strongly support, we add these two numbers together to come up with a fraction of respondents who, in some sense, support what's going on with the suicide bombing. It was already hovering in the neighborhood of 70%, came down a little bit towards 60%. Now, this was during 2001 to 2003. There haven't been that many suicide bombings lately, but just before coming here, I checked, and from the same source, I was able to discover that total support was measured at 45% in June of 06, 48% in September of 06. So, although it would again be lower than what you see here, still about 50% of people surveyed in the West Bank and Gaza claim to support suicide bombings targeting Israeli civilians. And again, I remind you, this is a Palestinian polling organization collecting these data. Let me tell you a little bit more about suicide bombings in this campaign. There are 4 main terrorist organizations that prosecuted these attacks. The Hamas, by far, conducted not only the most attacks, but if you take a look at the number of people killed in Hamas attacks, you see that the number of Israelis killed per bombing is actually higher for the Hamas than for the other 3 groups. The Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs, which is an offshoot of the Fatah movement, which, by the way, is the party of the current Prime Minister, Abu Mazen. And then there is the Popular Front of Liberation of Palestine, which is responsible for having perpetrated 4 attacks. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are, of course, both fundamentalist organizations, but the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine isn't religious at all. They're Marxist. And so it just goes to show you that suicide bombing as a tactic can be adopted by groups which actually have quite different ideologies. Where did the suicide bombers come from? This is a little bit interesting to actually take a look at the terror groups and take a look at the source of origin for the different terror groups. For example, we pick these different towns here. These are the main towns in the West Bank. And you see that Jenin, which is in the northern part of the West Bank, is primarily an Islamic Jihad time. Out of the 25 suicide bombings, 16 of them were instigated by the Islamic Jihad. On the other hand, you go to Nablus, and it turns out that most of the suicide bombings coming out of Nablus were associated with the Fatah, the Al-Aqsa group. From Hebron, which is known as perhaps the most conservative town in the West Bank, the most religious town, and majority of the suicide bombings were prosecuted by the Hamas and so on. We can perhaps get a better understanding of this if we take a look at the map. All right, so this is essentially a map of the West Bank and the center of Israel. What we have here are the 8 main Palestinian towns in the West Bank. I'll just identify these for you. This is Jenin. This is Nablus here. This is Tulkarm. And this is Qalqilia. This is Ramallah. This is Jericho. This is Bethlehem. And this is Hebron. And to orient you a little bit more, this agglomeration here is the urban sprawl of Tel Aviv. And here we have Jerusalem in the center. Haifa is up that way, as is Lebanon, as is the rest of the Levant. So these are the 8 towns in the West Bank, and the green arrows here show you the attack routes that were followed in the majority of suicide bombings. There were a couple of exceptions. For example, there was one case where a bomber from Hebron traveled all the way up to Haifa and perpetrated an attack. But by and large, you can see that there is a clear spatial logic to how these attacks were organized. Basically, people going from nearby towns to nearby targets. You can also see how popular Jerusalem was as a target here. And you can also see how, at Israel's narrowest point, Tulkarm to Netanyahu, which is a distance of maybe only about 15 miles across, that actually was the route of the more popular, the most common suicide bombings right at the beginning of the conflict. It's also interesting to note that there were never any suicide bombers who came from Jericho. Right? Jericho is sort of off on its own here and has been the more tranquil by far of the major Palestinian towns. All right. So what happened? In spite of the fact that there was a suicide bombing just this past week, there haven't been many the past few years, but there were lots. So why is it that we don't see so many? Suicide bombings were the leading cause of death, as I said, between 2001 and 2003, but there have been many fewer successful suicide bombings since then. So what happened? Well, let me say a little bit about what prior research into the whole suicide bombing phenomenon did. And the most important thing to point out is that a lot of the early work on this topic, writing that was going on in 2000, 2001, 2002, and not restricted to Israel, but actually talking about the phenomenon of suicide bombing worldwide, the point here is that the focus was on the suicide bombers and the bombings, successful attacks. Okay? So there were lots of studies of suicide bombers and suicide bombings. In fact, there are some public access data sets. Any of you who are interested can simply go to the internet, visit the Institute for Counterterrorism in Herzliya, Israel, www.ict.edu, and you will find a database. And in that database, it will tell you every suicide bombing. It will also talk about other kinds of terror attacks, which groups were the perpetrators, how many people were killed, how many people were injured, some information about the bombers themselves, and so forth. And some of these databases also tell you information like how much newsprint was devoted to the topic, and other information about the demographics of the bombers, how many siblings they had, whether they came from poor rich families, and so forth. Now, but there weren't any studies of the suicide bombing attack rate. And what do I mean by that? Okay, today's a special day. Why is today a special day? Because there wasn't a suicide bombing. There was no suicide bombing today. That's great. How come? All right? So the point here is that you can't really learn about how effective tactics are to counter suicide bombings if all you do is look at days on which there are bombings. You have to take a look at the days on which there were no attacks as well, and you have to start trying to understand how it is that successful terror attacks emanate in the face of countermeasures that are deployed on the ground. Okay? So where is the terrorist attack? When the terrorist attack, given the deployment of defensive measures over time and space, that was really what motivated this family of studies that my colleagues and I embarked on. So that's the question that I'd like to talk about today. Basically, how effective were various tactical countermeasures at preventing suicide bombings in Israel? That's what we want to talk about. Okay? how did the deployment of defensive measures influence the rates of attempted and successful suicide bombings over time? And in order to do this, we have to look at all time. Now, before I go further, it should be clear that I and any other analyst outside of the security establishment is at somewhat of a disadvantage. We don't have access to all of the information. But nonetheless, we have access to actually quite a bit of information. And in any event, I believe that the approach we adopt here is something which could be deployed if in fact, some more of the classified data were made available. But the basic idea here is to try and actually ask what works and what doesn't. So here are some of the tactical Israeli measures for which we can get data. There are preventive military operations. These are largely arrests, trying to arrest terrorists before they actually can carry out an attack, trying to destroy laboratories. Very controversial, of course, are the targeted killings, or what I'll call hits, on ticking bombs, that is to say, terror which is about to take place, a person en route to attack who is known to be in the late planning stages of an attack. The targeted hits on these folks as well as senior terrorist commanders, border closures and curfews of towns, en route interception of suicide bombers, and this could entail roadblocks, terror alerts, hot pursuit, alert citizens. So the difference between an interception and, say, an arrest is in an arrest, intelligence, advanced intelligence, lets people know where the would-be bomber is or where the suspect is, and the forces move in to try and actually arrest the person there, as opposed to someone who has actually already left the house, is on the way to carry out an attack, has the bomb belt or the bomb satchel with him, and is either interdicted on the way and stopped, or perhaps detonates, but detonates in a location different from what was intended, in which case the number of casualties could go down. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And of course, there is also the security barrier, referred to as a fence by some, a wall by others, but nonetheless, this is a large project, controversial to be sure, meant to halt the entry of suicide bombers and other terrorists into Israel. So these are a number of tactical countermeasures for which we could get some information. Now, how is it that we get some of these data? So first of all, the actual successful suicide bombings, I've already told you about the Institute for Counterterrorism data. Of course, there are other sources as well. These are the data which are most easily available. If a bomb blows up, everybody knows about it. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs maintains a listing of all successful bombings, and the Israeli and Palestinian media both cover these events, as do Western and pretty much media all over the world. Interceptions are more difficult to find out about, because you might say, if someone actually successfully interdicted a bomber, why would you expect that information to be published? The answer is the information wouldn't be published right away, but actually this information often comes out after the fact. If it turns out that a would-be bomber has been captured en route to a target, a week goes by, 2 weeks go by, people start to ask questions. How come so-and-so hasn't come home? We haven't seen this person for a while, and inquiries start to be made, so the information does come out. What happened here is that we were able to collect information on interceptions from both Israeli and Palestinian media and to get IDF verification. One of the members of our research team was also an IDF intelligence person, and so was able to go back and verify these after the fact. Now, hits, targeted killings. Where would we get information on targeted killings? Well, it should come as no surprise that human rights organizations are very interested in keeping track of data on targeted killings. And consequently, there's a pretty good database that has been put together by Beit Salem, which is the Israeli Association for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. The Beit Salem data not only tell you when hits occur, but they also keep track of the casualty counts, distinguishing between whether the persons killed were operatives or combatants, or whether the persons killed were civilians. Now, of course, there can be arguments back and forth about whether or not these classifications are accurate, but that's actually something that can be investigated in the analysis, and I'll just answer it up front. It turns out that that disagreement doesn't really change the flavor of the analysis at all. The events, which, as I said, are mainly intelligence-driven arrests, those data actually come from the IDF. I'll show you what a report of those data look like in just a few moments. To try to gain information on closure and curfews, we went to the Ministry of Defense spokesman's office and said, look, we've been able to put together, based on media accounts, a list of dates on which curfews were launched. on which closures were launched. We haven't been so successful in finding dates of which closures and curfews were lifted. Could you please tell us the dates? And a month goes by, and 2 months go by, and after a certain period of time, I was actually surprised to get a phone call from my colleague in Israel, and it turns out that the Ministry of Defense actually did get back and provided a list with dates of which closures were not only imposed, but were also lifted. Now, it turns out the Palestinian Red Crescent, independently of course, maintains their own data set. What they do is for each of those major towns in the West Bank, which I showed you earlier on the map, they keep track of how many curfew days there are, and they do it on a month-by-month basis. It was actually possible to go to both sources and see whether or not the lists coincided. And the interesting thing was that the total number of closure days was about the same by both sources. So in cases where you would expect there would be tremendous disagreement, it just doesn't always turn out that way. The security fence, to get data on the security fence, we actually went and interviewed Netzach Moshiach, who was the director of the entire Seam Zone project, and I just have to say something. This is such a controversial project, you would think that someone's office for this might be some fancy location, with all sorts of high-tech cameras or whatnot going on. The only thing I can say about this guy's office was that it was in a little trailer, but it was indeed surrounded by fences. Okay. So let's now take a look at some of the data describing these countermeasures and then see if we can make any sense out of this. So we'll start with the most controversial measure, which is hits. And this is a listing of what happened in 75 targeted hits between 2001 and 2003. Remember, the source for these data are Beit Salem, which is a human rights organization. And so on the basis of the Beit Salem data, what we can say is the following. Of these 75 hits, 10 of them completely went awry by the Beit Salem definitions, and that in 10 of these hits, only civilians were killed. 31 civilians were killed, and none of those targeted were killed. At the other end of the extreme, in 44 out of the 75 hits, only those targeted were killed. There were no civilian deaths, so 79 suspects were killed. And then in the remaining 21 hits, there were both civilians and those targeted who were killed. 21 hits led to 49 civilian deaths and 49 deaths of those who were targeted. What you see here is that in the 75 hits, the number of people targeted who actually were killed was 119, about 120, 80 civilians. There is about, on average, 1 civilian killed per hit. That was the historical record here over these 3 years. That's not to be taken lightly. Civilians are civilians. Now, as I said, one can get into arguments over the definitions, but basically the numbers don't change that much. Obviously, if you start saying, I'm not sure all of these civilians were civilians, the number's going to come down a little bit, but not that much, not enough to make a difference, it turns out. All right. Well, what we're interested in is not only the results that I'm showing you here, but whether or not these hits actually had a salutary, or perhaps they had a negative effect. Perhaps the hits actually encouraged more suicide bombings. We have to take into account that these tactics can backfire. So that's what we're going to do. But first, let me run through some of the other data here. Here's actually the distribution of Palestinian civilian deaths per hit. As I said, on many of these, there were no civilians killed, but on some, there were, and there were 1 or 2 very, very bad cases where a bomb just missed the target completely, hit an apartment block, and several people were killed, none of whom were those targeted. And if we take those Palestinian deaths from Israeli hits and make the same kind of a picture that we had with the Israeli civilian deaths from suicide bombings, what we see is actually, except for the scale here, for the actual numbers, a pattern which is not necessarily all that different. In fact, we can put them together here, where the bars going up represent the Israeli deaths from suicide bombings, the bars going down represent Palestinian civilian deaths from targeted hits. And what do we see? I mean, people talk about a cycle of violence, and this is one way of actually looking at it. You see deaths on one side followed by deaths on the other, and when there's a lot of suicide bombings, there are a lot of targeted hits and vice versa. Okay. We'll come back to these data when we start asking whether or not there was an effectiveness associated with the tactics or not. Let's go to the next countermeasure, preventive events. Now, the Israeli Defense Forces do provide data which describe what they call successful versus unsuccessful, or thwarted suicide bombing attacks. Here's the data. right? Let's take a look at this graph. What we have is starting in October of 2000 all the way through to November of 2004 on a monthly basis. We have the red bars and the blue bars. And the red bars are telling us the successful attacks, and the blue is telling us the unsuccessful attacks. And what do you see? If you just let your eye focus only on the red, you see a pattern which actually mimics this pattern on the top here. Those were the successful attacks. These are deaths from those attacks. But of great interest here are the blue bars. And why is it that we see so much more blue down here than back here? And the answer is because this campaign of going out and very aggressively on the basis of informants, human informants, on the basis of agents in the field, on the basis of signal intelligence, listening into cell phone conversations, intercepting messages, and so forth, following the suicide bombing in Netanya that I told you about before, Israel launched an operation called Defensive Shield, where, and people might remember this, the tanks went rolling into some of the West Bank towns, and that really led to a heavy attempt to infiltrate these networks, to collect information, to basically put as much pressure as possible on these organizations, the Hamas and the Al-Aqsa brigades and the Islamic Jihad. And so what happened here is that the number of arrests, and that's usually what these thwarted attacks are, went way up, and you see that the red bars went way down. Right? Okay. So let's again try to understand these data. Unsuccessful here means an arrest or a killing or an interception of terrorists or a destruction of labs or the capture of bombs or explosive belts. There was a more detailed IDF report that I got a chance to take a look at. It wasn't classified, but it was only posted in Hebrew. It wasn't posted in English, and it turned out that most of the events that were covered, they basically went through a 2-month period and gave you event by event what it was that they meant. That wasn't intended to rhyme. Event by event, the question was what were, in fact, these thwarted bombings. And it turned out that most of them were, in fact, arrests. Okay. So now let's go on to these en route interceptions. And again, the difference between an interception and an arrest is that an interception, the bomber is already in progress, is already on the way to carry out the attack, as opposed to not having gotten out of the house, which would qualify as a preventive event or an arrest. So in addition to these 85 successful bombers, there were 35 would-be bombers who were intercepted en route and prevented from reaching their targets. And as I said, these interceptions could result from hot intelligence, which could lead to issuing terror alerts, one of which we saw right at the beginning of this presentation. A terror alert doesn't have to be a fancy thing. It literally could say, don't go to this part of the country, or if you do, expect delays. It's a little bit like a traffic report, because there will be checkpoints and roadblocks and so on set up. Hot pursuit, but there are also a couple of noteworthy cases where interceptions occurred due to the actions of alert citizens. I think this is something which is important to realize, that in Israel, a great attempt has been placed, a great investment has been placed into educating the public, kids in schools, people in businesses, to understand what to do in the event of a terror attack, to understand how to recognize someone who is acting suspiciously. This information is printed in Hebrew, but it's also printed in English, in Russian, in Arabic, and possibly even in Amharic, if I'm not mistaken, which is the language of the Ethiopian immigrants to Israel. Let's take a look at this. What are suspicious signs that can give away a suicide terrorist? Clothes unsuitable for the time of year, for example, a coat in summer. A youngster who is trying to blend by dress and behavior with the surrounding population on public transport, entertainment places, among soldiers, even though he or she doesn't belong to the group. Anything protruding in an unusual way under the person's clothing, wires or bulky sections of the clothes and so forth. Suspicious behavior, nervousness, tension, profuse perspiration, and so on. Just by the way, it's also interesting that there's even a section here on how to behave if you find yourself around a suicide bombing or shooting. What to do if you're not only looking for someone who might be a perpetrator, but what do you do if you're caught in the event yourself? How do you identify a suspicious vehicle? Okay, now I mention this not only because it's important in understanding how several of these events actually were intercepted, but this appears to be what happened on Monday. Here's a report. Al Arabiya Television reported on Monday that the bomber, Mohammed Faisal al-Saksak, 21-year-old Gaza resident and member of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. According to reports by the security sources, at least 2 local residents had spotted al-Saksak, whose heavy coat and large bag aroused their suspicions and called the police. Eilat, remember, is on the Red Sea. In spite of the fact that it's the winter and the rainy season, it's hot there. And one doesn't walk around in heavy coats at this location. When al-Saksak, who according to security forces appeared to have stopped for coffee on his way to execute the bombing in a more crowded area, he saw police cars approaching the bakery and blew himself up. So the insinuation here is that these folks actually guessed that there was something suspicious about his behavior, called the police. When the police responded, he still was able to detonate his explosive, but in a different location than what was intended. Not downtown Eilat, didn't reach the actual most dense part of the city, instead reached a bakery on the way. All right, this graph summarizes just in frequency count, cumulative count, the total number of arrests, the total number of hits, the total number of actual suicide bombings, and the total number of interceptions over the 3 years that we focused most intensely on here, 2001 to 2003. And what's interesting is if you notice this purple line, which is the targeted killings, you'll see that actually it was the highest of all of these curves for the first part of this period, from about July 2001 until July 2002. But then the arrests after Operation Defensive Shield, the preventive events, simply took over. That's this blue line here. Right? Really took off. And if you take a look at what's going on with the suicide bombings themselves, which is the green curve, it might be a little bit hard for you to see it on this graph, it's going up, but as the blue curve starts to skyrocket, the green curve, it's still going up, but it tips over, it flattens. You see that? See how it's going up, and then all of a sudden it's slowing down. All right? So even from looking at this picture, there's a suggestion that these arrests might be having an awful lot to do with holding back the rate of successful suicide bombings in Israel. Okay. There are other measures, too. General closure, which I mentioned before. So, as I said, we were able to get information on general closure from the Ministry of Defense office. We were able to get dates the closure was lifted when the dates were known, and also from the Palestinian Red Crescent, which was just taken off of their website, which, as I said, gave curfew data for the main Palestinian towns. And then finally, there is the security barrier. Now, Gaza has been enclosed by a fence for a long time. There were only 2 successful suicide bombers that actually were able to infiltrate from Gaza. One of them was with British passports, which took place, that the perpetrators had British passports and were able to attack a restaurant called My Place to Leave. The other was an attack at the Ashdod port, which was actually a very sophisticated attack in that the bomber actually was inside a container that was actually brought into the port, and then he was already inside the container and came out and blew himself up. There are lots of fences and other barriers all over the country, and most of them don't seem to have all that much explanatory power in predicting the interception of suicide bombers entering Israel. So that didn't seem to help. But when we take a look at this thing called the security fence, this decision was taken because of the great rate of suicide bombings Israel was experiencing. And so what happened was, to understand if this fence is doing anything, you have to ask, well, it's not just a matter of there's a fence, there's not a fence. It takes time to build it. So what was happening is different portions of the fence were built, and did we see any changes at all in the patterns of suicide bombings as a result? So here's what the security barrier looks like in most of the country. It is true that in the places where the populations are at their densest, so right in locations such as Jerusalem or on the outskirts of Jerusalem, say, the edge of Tulkarm, the edge of Kalkia, some of these large towns, there is a physical wall there which is separating the populations, but the large majority of the mileage of this fence looks more like this. It's really a fence. And what you see are patrol roads and sensors here, observation systems, which are really meant to just block people from getting across, and if anyone was able to come through, would set off an alert in an office which would then alert the security forces that someone had tried to get through. Okay, so again, let's take a look at this map, which has a picture of the attack routes. And this was the part of the security fence that was finished as of the end of 2003, this purple line here, more or less running along the green line, although in some cases it dips in. And this was the planned route for the rest of the fence, and actually portions of the fence around Jerusalem have been finished, as well as some of the fence that is down here. This is now actually what the most recent map I was able to find of the security fence route looked like as of April 20th of last year. So there's the whole route down here in purple. Again, this is Jerusalem. This is Tel Aviv. Here's an example of where the security fence actually played a role in a particular terrorist attack. The Islamic Jihad cell that was located in Jenin had plans to attack a school in Yokneam. But the problem is in order to go from here to here, you have to go across the fence, which is right over here. So instead what happened was these two ended up going to a town called Burkin and then driving down to El Mukayr, and finally at Bardala they were actually intercepted by the forces, by security forces, and thus prevented the attack. Now, had they been able to go straight through, as opposed to having to sort of make this end run around the fence, it's likely that they would have been able to get there and to detonate before they would have been caught. So what you already see in this example is a sense by which what the security fence is able to achieve at a minimum is to change the geography. It's able to change the routing, change the locations of attacks, if not actually to completely reduce the frequency of these attacks, again constrained to the 3 years of study here. Here's actually the cumulative length of the fence as it was completed over time. So you see there's quite a bit of construction. The fence was becoming operational at a great pace between April and July of 2003, and then things slowed down. One of the reasons why things slowed down is because there are numerous court challenges in Israel. Every time they want to build a new section of the fence, there are legal challenges as to whether or not the fence can take that exact route. In several cases, Israel's Supreme Court has actually ruled in favor of the complainants in these cases, saying, no, this route, as you had planned to do it, does not adequately address the needs of Palestinian civilians. You're causing undue hardship. In other cases, the security benefits for Israelis are taken as primary, so it's a hard-fought legal battle every kilometer of the way before this thing will finally be completely up. All right. So these are the data. Now, how does the analysis work? I don't want to start writing down equations for this audience, but I do want to try and give you a sense for how the analysis proceeds. So we start by defining a launch as a suicide bombing attempt to where a terrorist is actually going to get started. So basically we're looking at the sum of successful and intercepted attacks. Right? These are basically attacks which either were successful or were meant to occur. And the idea is to build a mathematical model, a statistical model, where we're actually trying to predict what's the probability that there would be a launch as a function of all of these counter tactics that I've been talking about. So essentially, I'm going back to that very first idea. Today was a special day. There wasn't a suicide bombing. How come? Well, maybe there wasn't a suicide bombing because these people were arrested last night, or there was this targeted killing, or the fence was already in place in this part of the country, and so forth. But understand that the analysis is flexible. There's not a built-in assumption that the tactics are effective. That's what we want to find out. It's possible that you take certain actions and it could make things worse. That's actually, I think, an important point. All right, so what we want to do then is to try and predict the probability that we're going to see suicide bombings as a function of all of these tactics, and then the actual suicide bombings that happen are the launches that don't get intercepted. Right? The actual bombings that occur are the launches that were not intercepted. So here's sort of what the schematic looks like, if you want to think of it this way. You have preventive actions, you have closure, you have hits. All of these things are dictating when you have launches, and the question is whether or not the bombing has been stopped or not, and if not, then it's possible that the bomber is still intercepted, or you actually end up with an uncontested, as it were, suicide bombing where it successfully explodes. Successful, of course, from the perspective of the terror organizations. All right. So we're able to replicate with a pretty high degree of accuracy the actual rate of suicide bombing attempts and successes over time. Here's a graph, which I hope the resolution is clear enough for you to see, where the actual observed number of suicide bombings in total, these are the launches, so it runs up all the way to 120 here. That's given by the blue line. So every time there is a suicide bombing, there's an uptick of 1 in this line. If nothing happens, it stays flat. Uptick, flat, uptick, flat. All right? And here we have this purple line, which you notice is sort of running right through here, which are the predictions of the number of suicide bombings from this model. So the idea here is that if you know something about the deployment of these various counter tactics, you can actually make a prediction of how many suicide bombing launches there would be. And in putting this model together, you gain some information about which of these tactics seem to be causing the rates to go up and which of these tactics are causing the rates to go down. Actually, cause is probably too strong a term. Which of the tactics are associated with the rates going up, which of the tactics are associated with the rates going down, that's actually an important distinction, and we'll see why in a few moments. So starting with these preventive events then, it turns out that indeed they are associated with a reduction in suicide bombing attempts, and it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise given the data that I showed you earlier. Remember the blue curve after Operation Defensive Shield, following March 2002, all of a sudden those preventive events, those arrests really took off, the suicide bombing rates came down. You can almost see this result right from that picture. Now, here's a controversial result. The statistical evidence that hits were associated with not a decrease, but rather an increase in the number of suicide bombings is actually quite strong. That is to say, you go through the usual sorts of statistical procedures here, you get the sense that targeted killings instead of preventing bombings, actually led to downstream suicide bombings. That's what the data would suggest if you simply put them through your sort of standard statistical analyses. There were 75 such hits, and if indeed this is really correct, that of course would suggest that this is a measure that badly backfired. We're going to come back to that though and ask whether or not that actually is the appropriate interpretation. But that's where we are at the moment here. There's an interesting result which comes out. It relates interceptions and what I call endogenous defense. If you take a look at the expected number of suicide bombing attacks in any given month, and when I say expected monthly suicide bombing attacks, it's basically the number that's being predicted by this model, okay? What you find is that the probability that any one of them would have been intercepted, the fact that any one of them would have been caught en route actually goes up the more attacks there would be. Now, let's make sure that we understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that if there's more attacks, therefore you catch more in total. That would make sense. I mean, if you have a 10% chance of catching any attack, if I double the number of attacks, I double the number I catch, right? But that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that as the number of attacks goes up, maybe your chance of catching any one of them goes from 10% to 20%, or 20% to 30%. Say, so what's going on here? So what it does is it suggests that there's an endogeneity here, that if in fact there's an expectation that there are going to be more attacks, that in some sense the defenses are tightening, and there's a better chance of actually catching somebody before the act. So that was something that was a bit of a surprise that came out of the analysis. The results for closures and curfew. General closure by itself, surprisingly enough, shows no independent effect. If all you do is say bombings during closures, bombing when there weren't closures, you don't see a difference. But on the other hand, here's the most important thing to realize. What is going on is the following. During the days which there were closures, you have many more of these arrests. You have many more of these preventive events. So what's going on? Okay, imagine how this works. Intelligence comes in and says, we think that there is a person with a high likelihood in a particular location in a particular town. Therefore, we're going to send the security forces in to try and capture this person. Is that the only thing that's going to happen? No. There's going to be a curfew placed on the town to try and get everybody off the streets in order to go in and catch the person. And so basically what you get is this idea of the closure curfew idea and the going in and doing these very aggressive arrests working hand in hand, as opposed to thinking of them as completely independent tactics. So it looks like these closure curfews are probably enabling these preventive events. Okay, the security fence now. And it turns out that the effective defense, again sort of interesting perhaps, The effect really was more on shifting the location of the attacks between 2001 and 2003 as opposed to completely lowering the rate of the attacks. It moved them around. The areas that were most protected by defense, that is, those locations in the country where defense became operational the first, the rates of attacks in those places plummeted. But what happened instead was that the attacks moved to a different part of the country. So Netanya and Hadera, right over on the west coast of Israel, right near the sort of thinnest part of the country, that's where most of the suicide bombings were initially. But there was a compensating increase in the volume of attacks in Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem was actually a frequent target all the way along. And it remains unprotected, although actually it's more protected than it was. There are a few gaps in the seam going around Jerusalem. So let's just take a look at this series of graphs. What we have are suicide bombings in 3 different parts of the country: Hadera, Netanya, the Tel Aviv area, and the Jerusalem area. And if you look at the beginning here, you see all of these attacks that were happening in Hadera and Netanya, and then all of a sudden they stop happening. Right? What's going on? Well, the security barrier was just that section of it getting finished right around here. And it became very hard for people to actually get through and perpetrate attacks in those locations. But what happened is those attacks, instead of happening there, got pushed down into the Tel Aviv area. And as I said, Jerusalem was still a pretty popular target all the way through there. A few at the beginning, a few at the end, a lot in the middle. All right. Summarize thus far. Summarize thus far. What we've got are preventive arrests which look like they're associated with reductions in suicide bombings. We've got targeted killings which look like they're associated with increases in suicide bombings. We've got closures and curfews which don't independently prevent suicide bombings, at least according to the data, but they seem to facilitate the preventive events. So the issue here is that trying to sort of parcel out a marginal effect might be a mistake. If the closures and the curfews are sort of coinciding with the times that these arrests go on, then it makes sense that you wouldn't necessarily see anything in the data suggesting that the curfews were independently doing anything. And finally, the security fence, at least through the end of 2003, and we're now several years down the road from there, acted more to change the location than the rate of suicide bombings. All right. But now I want to take a little bit of time to talk just a touch more abstractly. Everything we've done so far is data, on-the-ground operations. Here's the thing. This business of trying to evaluate counter-terror tactics is not the same as trying to evaluate, say, whether a fertilizer is effective in an agricultural experiment, or whether a particular drug is effective or not in treating a certain disease. We don't have natural control here at all. And in particular, it's not as if the terrorists are going to simply stay static during this. They change their behavior in response to what the tactics are. And by the way, it's not as if the Israeli deployment of these measures is random. The timing of the deployment of these measures itself is motivated by what? A targeted killing by statute is launched when you expect that there's going to be an attack, for example. You have good reason to believe that there's going to be an attack. Now, the fact that there's endogeneity here, that the timing of the countermeasures is going to matter, that's going to affect an assessment of their effectiveness. And this is where the difference between the word association and the causality becomes very clear. Let's just focus on targeted killings for a moment. As again, I'm saying the timing is not random. The timing is actually when intelligence suggests that a terror attack is imminent. So what you have to ask yourself is the following question. This is the counterfactual. What would the suicide bombing rate have been at those times when hits were ordered, if at those same times hits hadn't been ordered? Say it again. What would the suicide bombing rates have been at those times hits were ordered, if in fact hits hadn't been ordered? Because why were the hits ordered? The hits were ordered because you expected that there was going to be terror attacks. All right. So what you need is a counterfactual. You need to have a way of thinking about this. So let's go back and take a look at this for a moment. What are the rules governing hits? Well, we have an expert sitting right here in the front. This is something that Amos has written about. So he can complain if I don't represent this properly. But basically, the Judge Advocate General has listed the conditions which govern when hits can be ordered. And here they are. There has to be substantial evidence that terrorists are planning attacks in the future. the terrorist targeted. The hits are only supposed to occur after attempts to arrest the suspects have failed, or they've proven impossible. So the whole point is those times that hits were executed, you would have expected suicide bombing rates to be higher than normal. Is that clear? You would have expected them to be higher than normal. So here's an example of a counterfactual. Let me explain this picture. It's a little bit complicated, but here's the idea. What we have on the horizontal axis here is a measure of intelligence. I'm calling it signal value. The way to understand this is if the signal value is low, intelligence doesn't think there's much of a chance of an attack. If the signal is high, an attack is imminent. Now, let's imagine what would happen if there was no targeted killing policy. What you would expect if the intelligence was anyway accurate is that the higher the signal, the higher the attack rate. So this blue line here represents what you would expect in the way of suicide bombing attacks if you never did anything, but as a function of the intelligence signal. Does that make sense? You think an attack is more likely, you get more attacks. You think an attack is less likely, you don't get attacks. Now let's imagine the following policy, which is, if the likelihood of an attack gets beyond an acceptable threshold, we have to say what that acceptable threshold was here, then you try to do something about it. And suppose what you try to do is to launch a targeted hit. And for the sake of argument, let's assume that the hits are actually effective. And what do I mean by effective? Without the hits, the number of attacks looks like this top blue curve. But with the hits, it looks like this black curve, which is lower. See? It comes from here down to here. Now, if you knew the exact decision making, if I had access to these intelligence signals, it would be possible to actually try and execute an analysis like this. But what do I know as the analyst working with public data? Well, I see days on which there were hits. In other words, I see everything to the right of the signal. I see days on which there weren't hits. I see everything to the left of the signal. I see the number of suicide bombing attacks when there weren't hits. Averaging out, I'm going to get this flat line here to the left. That's what this dashed line is. I see the average number of attacks to the right of the signal on the days when there were hits. Lo and behold, it looks as if on days when there were hits, you get more attacks than on days when there weren't hits. And that's exactly what I said we saw on the data, right? It looks like when you have hits, you get more attacks than when you don't. But that's what you would see here when, by construction in this example, the hits are actually beneficial. Are you following the logic? What I'm saying is that you could have a policy which is working well, and you would conclude that it's failing. And it's a statistical artifact, and you need to figure out how to wipe that out. Okay, so now Amos is telling me that I only have a minute or something to finish. You tell me, are you interested in just hearing a little bit more of this last part? Yeah. All right, let me just finish this last part. By popular vote. I'm not in my own school, so this really is a democracy. The idea here is to take account of two different kinds of uncertainty, strategic versus random. Look, when we think of random acts, terrorism is no different from earthquakes or the rain. That's a probabilistic view of uncertainty. Everything that happens is just due to chance. But strategic uncertainty is different. It's reactions of an adverse interested party. And in the targeted killings case, it works in reverse. The Israeli timing of these things is not random. The timing is, in fact, trying to satisfy its own interest. So the interactions between terrorists and the government are dominated by strategic uncertainty, not probabilistic uncertainty. Strategic uncertainty. The terrorists have objectives, and the government has objectives. And their objectives obviously conflict with each other. So the methodology that's used to model situations like this is known as game theory, and I'm not going to make claims on the Nobel Prize, but Robert Oman, who did win the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, won it exactly for game theory. And the application for which he's most famous has to do with the arms race and nuclear disarmament involving the Soviet Union and the U.S. All right, so here's, in a nutshell, what a strategic analysis of counterterrorism would look like. I'm just going to give you a very simple case, all right? And here's how it goes. I'm just going to skip through to a very simple game. Let's imagine that we're asking what's going to happen in 1 month. We're going to have a 1-month conflict. Everybody agrees the conflict's over at the end of the month. That would be good, right? It doesn't work that way. We have a 1-month conflict. So here's how it works. The terrorists are going to choose an attack rate. And the attacks are going to evade existing defenses with some chance. They either get through or they don't. Successful attacks are going to kill some number of civilians. The terrorists have to pay when they attack. I mean, at a minimum, they lose the person who's doing the suicide bombing. There are other costs involved as well. And in the simplest case, what's the government response? Well, they could do nothing, which would be like to the left of the line, the left of the signal value, or they could order a hit that, with some chance, is going to thwart the attack, but it also, on average, is going to cost civilian lives on the other side. Right? The terrorists want to kill Israeli civilians. They have to account for their costs. That's their objective. The benefits in this short-run game are trying to prosecute successful attacks. The costs are actually losing their own personnel. And on the Israeli side, they obviously want to minimize the Israeli loss of life. They'd also like to avoid civilian casualties on the other side. So it turns out that if you analyze this using the tools of game theory, in this very simple model, there is an equilibrium that results. And what the equilibrium tells you is what's the optimal strategy for the terrorists, what's the optimal strategy for the government. And lo and behold, in the simplest model, here's what the optimal government strategy is. It is simply, if expected Israeli civilian lives saved from a hit exceeds the expected number of Palestinian lives lost in a hit, then hit. Say it again. If you save more civilian lives on your side than you cause on the other side, then hit. Now, you could say, wait a minute, there's no way that people are weighing the civilian casualties on both sides equally. That's not my point. If you did, you would end up with this trigger strategy. If you didn't, you'd still have a trigger strategy. It would just push over more. Instead of saying the number of lives has to exactly balance, it could be off by a factor of 2, off by a factor of 3. But the point is that the game theory model gives you exactly this picture. All right? Now, the terrorists actually also have an optimal strategy. If the cost of an attack exceeds the benefits in the absence of a hit, then don't attack. I mean, if it costs me more to attack than I gain in benefits, why would I ever launch an attack? All right? Well, we see lots of attacks, so presumably this first statement doesn't hold. But what about the next one? Well, if the cost of an attack is less than the benefits when there's no hit, so it makes sense for the terrorists to attack. But on the other hand, if there is a hit, then it's no longer beneficial to do it. Well, then what you do is you just attack at a rate not quite high enough to induce the hit. You attack at a rate that's not quite high enough to induce the hit. All right? Now, people look at this kind of modeling and they say, oh, come on, are you telling me the terrorists are rational? Well, let's take a look at what's going on here in the realm of terror tactics. It wasn't always suicide bombings that dominated. At the beginning of this conflict, actually, what you saw were shootings. Shootings on the roads, shootings into suburbs like Gilo in the south of Jerusalem. Israel responded by blocking off the roads, by building up barriers against the neighborhoods so that shots couldn't come in. The suicide bombing campaign started. The suicide campaign has fizzled out largely, but now there's a new tactic, Qassam rockets, which are being launched. And they haven't come down yet. There's effectively no counter to this. If you normalize each of these strategies by their peak year, what you get are waves of terror tactics. First it was shootings, then it was suicide bombings, now it's Qassam rockets. And one could even argue that right now we're in sort of the equilibrium that last little example I suggested portrayed. In other words, the Qassam rockets, there's lots of them. The actual number of civilians or anybody killed on the Israeli side has been pretty low to this point. There have been a few very close calls, rockets almost hitting a chlorine tank, for example, or an ammonia tank that would have exposed thousands of people to poisonous gases. The point here is that this is exactly the sort of behavior you would expect from a rational group of actors, not from a random group of actors. There's a tactic, a countermeasure is developed that seems to control it. There's a shift to the next tactic, a countermeasure seems to develop to control it, and now we see movement to the other tactics. Okay, so I apologize for having run over my time, and I know Amos is going to yell at me tonight, but nonetheless, that's a summary of where we are in trying to understand the tactical evaluation of suicide, counter-suicide bombing measures. Thank you.
What we're going to do now is we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. The way it works is raise your hand. The people here with microphones, wait until the mic comes to you.
I want to go a little bit off the board. tangential to your focus. You had these two slides about instructional, educational material for Israelis in
Yes.
Arabic. Do you know of anything here on a similar scale? Well, obviously not a similar scale, but anything going on in the United States to educate people on what to do and what to look for?
Closest thing I can think of is buy duct tape. No, if you think about it, I mean, there was some concern about what every home should have in the event of a terror attack. We were all urged to stock up on bottled water. We were urged to create plans on where we would meet family members and so forth. But to my knowledge, I don't know of anything which literally says, how do you, what are the signs of a suspicious character? How should you behave if you actually found yourself in a terror attack?
Plans or ideas?
I'm sorry?
How about plans or ideas to do that?
Again, I can't really say. I think that it's a different kind of terror campaign, obviously, that Israel has experienced. The worry here has been much more on the mass casualty events, and so that's really where the emphasis has been placed.
Could you please?
But on that score, there have been a number of materials. It's not clear how well they've been assimilated. I mean, how many of you have duct tape at home? Okay, not bad. How many of you have bottled water in preparation for an emergency? Some. All right, you don't have to put your hands up. I, on the other hand, have bottled water. Okay, yes, sir.
There's two things I'd like you to respond on. The first, had the barrier, the wall, or the fence, as you call it, was built right along the green line, would it be as effective? And second, is there a correlation between land confiscation, home demolitions, and the suicide rate? Thank you.
Well, let's see. If indeed the security barrier had been built right along the green line, which actually is the route that most of it seems to be following these days, although there are a few dips, would it be as effective at actually defending the heart of the country? It seems to me the answer would have to be yes. The issue here is that there is still a dispute going on. And so you have some fairly large places like Ariel in disputed territory, which are on the Israeli side of the barrier, which obviously if it was on the other side, they wouldn't be protected. So it's not, there are a few other aspects here which have more to do with restriction of movement in the Palestinian territories than the actual placement of the barrier in terms of trying to prevent cells from connecting, passing materials to each other, and so forth. I think the issue here really has to do with saying where does one draw the line between security on the Israeli side and disrupting the daily lives of Palestinians on the other hand. And so that's a judgment, as I said, which is being decided by the courts on a daily basis, and it's hard for me to sort of second guess it. Now, the other question you said was?
On land confiscations and home demolitions, is there a correlation between that and suicide bombing?
Well, there's certainly a correlation between home demolitions and suicide bombings, because every time a suicide bombing occurred, the home was demolished. So there's an order effect here, which is difficult. Now, having said that, it's impossible to say whether or not home demolitions help or hurt. If you think about it, there's no variation. There are many people who feel that home demolitions actually do, in fact, prevent some would-be bombers from becoming bombers, and then there are others who feel that, no, it actually is completely not effective. And this is one question that you simply can't tell because there's a one-to-one correspondence between the bombings and the home demolitions.
Can I just interject?
I'm sorry?
Can I just interject?
Yeah, go ahead. Interject whenever you want.
I would just interject on that note that 2 years ago, the government stopped the policy of demolishing the homes. The policy had been based on a principle of deterrence, and former Prime Minister Sharon simply reached the conclusion it was no longer effective in the deterrence concept, as a point of fact.
Just yesterday, 2 homes were demolished in Beit Hanina near Jerusalem.
That's two different kinds of demolitions. There's demolition, I don't want to steal the show.
Okay,
Two different kinds of demolitions. One is based on security rationalization, and the other when homes were built without building permits. The ones in Beit Hanina, I think, were without a building permit.
A quick question. You showed several cities that the bombers came from,
Yeah.
and there was one city where there was no bombers.
Jericho.
Jericho. Did you do any kind of analysis to understand what the demographics or the difference in the demographics between those cities were? And then the second question I had is, for the bombers that were successful versus the people that were unsuccessful, have you had an opportunity to maybe understand what makes a successful bomber versus what makes an unsuccessful bomber? Education, background, or is it just that they got caught?
Well, with the second question first, there was initially a profile of who suicide bombers were, and that profile has essentially gone out the window. And you have had female suicide bombers, you have had elderly suicide bombers, you have had young suicide bombers, all of whom have succeeded. And some, I can't say across the board from, if there are enough from each category so that you could even do the sort of analysis you're proposing, which is to say, are there some demographics that work and some that don't. I can report some work that has been done theoretically, not by me, but by some other scholars in the area. And their argument goes like this. People, again, make choices as to whether or not they want to join these organizations or not, and it largely has to do with the opportunities they see facing them. And so you would presume that people who have better economic opportunities are not going to be the ones who will volunteer to become suicide bombers. However, among those who do volunteer to become suicide bombers, the terror organizations actually have their pick. They can take the ones who they think will be the most successful, and the question of how they do that is less likely, I think, to be a matter of just the demographics in terms of any skill or ability. I think it much more has to do with trying to confuse the other side. You want to create an uncertainty that says that a suicide bomber could in fact be anyone. So it makes it much more difficult to profile. So I think that's what's going on there. Now, what was the other comment?
Was there any difference between Jericho and the other cities' demographics, distance to target, that type of thing?
Well, other than the fact that it's a little bit further and geographically it's a little bit more difficult. I mean, Jericho is actually right down in the Dead Sea Basin, and there's one road which comes up, so it's a little bit more difficult, I think, to get through. But I actually haven't done any detailed analysis. But what we do know is that, Saeb Erekat and a few other influential legislators in the Palestinian Authority are from that town, and they've actually, I think, tried to put some individual influence on keeping things calm there. Jericho, of course, was, unlike some of these other places, a very successful tourist destination for a long time. So, there are assets that can serve there that you may not have elsewhere. But this is speculation on my part. I haven't done a systematic study as to why it is that the organizations haven't recruited attackers from Jericho. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Have the launches from suicide bombings, which include both, attempted suicide bombings and successful suicide bombings, increased as the defensive measures increased?
The launches have, yes. There are many more launches now. So what you have up is this interesting situation where there are attempts ongoing all the time, but very few have been getting through.
Do you think it's because of the defensive measures that are being put on to these territories that increase the launches?
Well, it's possible. It's possible. But one of the things that I actually didn't get to here in the talk is that there are other benefits to the terror organizations from trying to launch these bombings than simply having them succeed. It turns out that they're a terrific recruiting device in terms of getting people to join the organizations. Successful bombings, and also when harsh measures come back, especially the targeted killings, that does seem to work to motivate the population, and some people may join the organization and others not. So in some sense, there seems to be a premium in some of these organizations to sort of at least setting out the signal that they're active, that they're continually on the attack, that they haven't given up their goal of trying to eliminate the state. Yeah.
You mentioned two possible conclusions about the targeted killing data as to how either it could indicate that targeted killing increases the number of suicide bombings, or it could be with the game theory stuff that it simply happens at the times when there's the highest number of bombings. And if you had access to more data, would you be able to distinguish this theoretically, and how?
Well, the data which really should serve to answer this would be if you understood very, very clearly what triggered each of these targeted killings. That's what you would need to know. Because basically what you would want to do is factor that out of the equation in some sense. All right? So worded differently, if I had the information on the intelligence signal, if I can use that language here, one could actually try and fit a model that more or less looks like the picture I showed you. And then the question would be, do you in fact get this separating curve like you would expect, or is there no such break? So it really is in the realm of trying to understand the timing of this that you'd have to have the data on that in order to figure it out. As it is now, we've got two stories which sound pretty in contrast to each other, but they're actually both consistent with the data. Targeted killings could be effective, and you would see more suicide bombings following targeted killings. Both of those things could be true. And so in order to know which is which, you really have to sort of take this timing artifact out of it. So, people who have access to that, namely the folks inside the military, they could do that. They could do that sort of analysis. That's not all that uncommon in econometric work.
I assume that your data is that the Israeli Defense Forces and intelligence is very interested in your data. Wouldn't this? But wouldn't because it may help them. Mm-hmm. But wouldn't it also be helpful to the terrorists? In other words, do you have any evidence that they read your papers and look at stuff too? It seems to me that would probably be a good thing to do.
Well, all of this is public information.
No, I understand.
So, if I take your point that somehow or another this analysis could have taught them something that they wouldn't have known beforehand, I have a hard time actually believing that. I think they probably know a lot more about this than I do. There have been some very interesting interviews with captured terrorists, and actually the most interesting interview I know of is with someone who's at large. Did you see this? There was an interview with Mohammed Deif, who was the sort of military commander in the Hamas. And it had to do with sort of decision making. When do you decide to attack? Who do you recruit? Who don't you recruit? And so forth. And what came through in this interview was essentially someone who is quite shrewd and understands tactics very well. They take into account the cost of attacks. They don't, according to him, order attacks if the likelihood of success is small. They put a lot of emphasis on the operational logistics, just literally figuring out the sort of moment-by-moment means of getting people to their targets so you could have a production stream, as it were, which is producing the explosives on the one hand, a recruitment stream on the other hand, which is bringing people together who would prosecute these attacks. And then in the middle, you have these very valuable logistics types who are constantly trying to find the weaknesses in the defenses. How can you move through? So they actually seem to me to be quite shrewd. I think they're way ahead of anything I would do.
You were discussing before the problem of profiling, and you made the observation that there had been efforts by suicide people ordering these things to diversify to thwart analysis. I'm curious as to whether there's been either any study or any decision made from existing data by either the Israeli Defense Forces or other person scholars that give you, and people that have studied like you, any grounds for concluding that the primary reasons or the principal reasons for the individual who's recruited as a suicide bomber is either, for example, religious fanaticism, hatred of an adversary with a perceived or real oppressive position, or economic, or what?
Economics is important. People would, the families of bombers would receive monetary sums. You might
$1,000 for successful on 5,000 projects.
So, but I have not actually done such a study, all right? I haven't done such a psychological study. But all I can say is that everything you say plays into it. The most important thing, though, from my standpoint, is to get away from focusing on the bombers themselves. Because from the standpoint of the people who are really running these terror organizations, there's not that much of a difference between a suicide bomber and a delivery truck. There's not that much of a difference between a suicide bomber and a Qassam rocket, except that the suicide bomber is much more accurate, much more of an intelligent weapon. The people who are actually running the show are not volunteering for operations. They're designing attacks, they're plotting it, or they have plotted a terror strategy, and suicide bombers are their guns. They're just tools. And so I think that while there were many studies which tried to look at the psychological profiles of suicide bombers to try and understand, are they people who for a variety of reasons, because they lost family members in past battles with Israeli soldiers, out of religion, because of economics, whatever it is. But I think the real answer here, and again, this is something I can't answer with data, but there's one paper about this that I think is actually quite interesting on the theoretical plane, and that is that among the pool of people who volunteer to do this sort of thing, the terrorist leaders have their pick. It's very much a matter of tactics. It's a resource which these organizations have that they can use. And that, I think, is the most important thing to realize, and not so much the individual details of the individual bombers. Two more questions. Sir.
Glad to hear the money's gone down since Saddam, who was paying $25,000, $35,000.
Inflation.
Huh?
Inflation.
No, we said it's gone down to 10,000 as deflation. Question again about targeted killings. I couldn't follow everything you said about the counterfactual.
Okay.
But there's another school of thought that says, you go after the leaders, you hit them, and you drive them crazy, more crazy. I mean, they're already angry and mad as in lunatic and insane and irrational. But you really, and you take off the leaders, you take off the more capable people, and then you might create more, but they're less capable, less competent, and sort of more flailing away.
And actually, sort of consonant with that argument is the idea that even if you did get downstream retaliatory terror attacks, because of that, they might be more spontaneous, less organized, and in some sense of lower quality, and hence easier to prevent, precisely because the people with the skill in this game have been taken out. If you take a look at who it was that Israel was targeting, it did change over the course of the campaign. At the beginning, there were many more actual hits on operatives, and it was only later in the campaign that the focus shifted more towards the leadership. It's still hard to know at this point really what the upshot is, because you could say, well, this is simply going to cause these people to run scared, but it's not immediately clear. It's always a question of what's in their interest. If it was really causing people to run scared, then why is it that we see so many attempts all the time? Why is it that we see many times a week people are captured with suicide bullets and so forth? So the attempt at suicide bombings, I don't think has gone down that much. But the success of the bombings has gone down a lot.
Last question.
I just wanted to ask you about, you spoke how the preventative tactic of arrests led to a decrease in the frequency of suicide bombings, but the targeted killings led to an increase, at least according to the model. I was wondering how each of those tactics has affected military deaths on the Israeli side. If there was an increase in military deaths when arrests were used, or whether there was an increase.
One of the reasons for using targeted killings is precisely when it's judged impossible or too risky to launch an arrest. As I showed you in the Judge Advocate General's ruling before, targeted killings are only supposed to take place when it proves impossible to arrest them. Now, during Operation Defensive Shield, when a lot of these initial actions sort of took off, there were many Israeli deaths. It is much riskier for the soldiers to go in, to actually go into a town and try to essentially catch someone in the middle of the night, especially if the other side, which has their own intelligence, is ready for you. And there have been cases where Israeli soldiers have walked into ambushes. So it is riskier. And some have argued that that's actually another reason why one should rely more on targeted killings, simply because it places less risk on the soldier. But actually, there's another point of view here, which I think is in favor of arrests as opposed to targeted killings, and that is a successful arrest and a successful targeted killing will both take the target out of operation. But it's hard to interrogate the subject of a missile strike. But if you capture someone, you can actually learn something. You might learn who's next in the chain, you might learn who the adjacent terrorist cells and so forth. So I think the emphasis is very much on trying to capture people alive wherever possible. And sometimes that comes at great risk to the soldiers. But on the other hand, if it turns out that the person is simply judged too dangerous, if there is a ticking bomb, if there are plans in progress and there's no other way to get to them, that's when the targeted killing will be ordered.
All right, hang on. Couple of comments in closing. I should have mentioned that a year and a half ago when the Institute was established, the mandate that I received was to create the Institute that provides the greatest opportunity to really research and think about the issues of global security. I said to myself that we're going to bring in lecturers from all different kinds of disciplines who truly have a creative approach to the most important issue of the day, which is terrorism. I think that Professor Kaplan's lecture today exactly exemplifies why the Institute was established. It could not have been better. I should add on a different note, or a similar note, that in my former career in the Israel Defense Forces, I personally was involved in targeted killing decisions. And so much of what I heard today, in many ways, brings back what I did in my former life. And I think the fact that you're able to explain something that's extraordinarily difficult to an audience that is not necessarily mathematically oriented and is not necessarily PhD candidates in operational research says a great deal about you. And so on behalf of all of us, many, many thanks. No. This is a sweatshirt, which you will proudly wear, because it says the Institute for Global Security, Law and Policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
There's a reception out.